Sorry, good.
Better to a restricted audience anyway. Sorry. So, good morning, everyone. Steve Collier from the Agency of Agriculture, here to talk to you about S124. Thank you so much for having us in to talk about this. It's kind of a long, winding story to get to this point. So, this bill is really complicated, but it's actually at its core, it's very simple. So it helps me to think about the simple parts before I delve into the more complicated parts. So if you don't mind, I'll give you just kind of an overview of, from our perspective, what this is all about. And obviously it's about clean water, which is incredibly important to Vermont. And it's about farms' role in ensuring that they are keeping our waterways as clean as possible. So it's a critical function, critical mission. The reality, though, is it's a good news story. And it's not coming at us from a good news perspective, but we just want to kind of reemphasize that, how important it is that farmers are doing the work. And that gets lost a lot of times in the shuffle. But the reality is that, and it's costly to farms. It's not easy what they're doing, in the state and the federal government have both made big investments to help these changes happen. But the reality is our farms are continuously stepping up and they're getting the work done. And it's effective and efficient. So about since 2016, when the Vermont version of the Clean Water Act 64, Vermont version of the Clean Water Act passed, farms have been consistently leading the charge in reducing phosphorus runoff. And in terms of the proven phosphorus reductions over that period of time, farms have always been responsible for at least 80% of the annual reductions, and usually more than 90% of the annual proven phosphorus reductions. That's with about a quarter of the overall investment. So it's a great story. That doesn't mean we're done. We have more to do under the TMDL. We have more work to be done. But it's wonderful from our perspective that we're in this spot. And in talking to farmers, routinely as we do, they're frustrated, understandably, because they feel under the gun, they feel targeted, they feel like instead of being appreciated, they're always being attacked. And that's not easy to do when you're also running a farm and dealing with all of the litany of challenges that come with that. So I think we need to think about how, and it's because of the legislature, it's because of our folks in our shop at the Agency of Agriculture who have been out there regulating farms, but mostly it's because of the farmers themselves. They bought in, not perfectly. We always have some people who are less, are more reticent and less willing to come along than others. But farms are not saying to us, no, we won't do it. They're saying to us, how can we? How can we pay for it? How can we get it done? What can we do? We want to do our part. And that's wonderful.
Never, Brian?
Steve, we hear this a lot about that farmers are doing way more than anybody else really in Vermont on the TMDLs and phosphorus. Have you ever seen a metric on, in the last 100 years of our sort of phosphorus situation, how much were farmers accountable for?
I'm sure there's people who know that. I don't. I'm sorry, but
no, it seems like data we should know, right? Yeah.
I mean, the phosphorus legacy situation is that's a serious one that it will plague us for some time. But I don't know percentages, and obviously the legacy is something that the continual contributions is what creates the current problem, and nobody wants our lakes to eutrophy and die. So it's important that we keep working on it. But the good news is we are meeting the goals so far, and we have more to do. But I just don't want to lose sight of that. And then this whole issue about the CAFO permit, it's so confusing, but it's really quite simple. And it's what's confusing, I think, about it is that the Federal Clean Water Act regulates discharges. So if you think about factories, you think about wastewater treatment places, like anybody who's discharging into water, they need a permit to do that. And the permits are designed to minimize effluents and pollutants as much as possible. But there is some allowance as long as the overall water quality requirements are being met. The interesting thing about farms is there is no right to discharge. So even though it's called the discharge permit, farms still can't discharge. And that's kind of a really confusing thing when we talk about, and it's really important when it comes down to whether federal law applies or state law applies. But even though farms, if it's illegal for anyone to discharge from a point source, to discharge waste from a point source, that includes farms. So if you have a pipe going into a lake and you don't have a permit to allow it, that's illegal under the Clean Water Act. That's true whether you're a farm or a factory. The curious thing about farms is certain types of farms, and those are CAFOs or concentrated animal feeding operations, they themselves are point sources. So that's why they get treated differently than a farm that's not a concentrated animal feeding operation. So when you are a CAFO, you are a point source. So different rules apply to you because of that. And here's the curious part, concentrated animal feeding operations still are not allowed to discharge. They can't, if they do discharge, it's a violation of the Clean Water Act and they're required to get a permit. There's a little bit of leniency in there. If you can fix the problem, you may not need a permit. But generally speaking, certainly if you're going to have ongoing discharges and you're a CAFO, you need a permit.
We talked about this a little bit. I'll just jump in here yesterday. Not everybody was here. And it sounded like if it's something that can be fixed over period of a couple of days, then you fix it and move on. If it's something that requires more investment, more time, you have to get a permit, but you still have to fix it.
Right.
And over time, and I don't know how long time might typically be, but you can't continue discharging.
Correct. That's correct. That's what's so fascinating to me about this whole issue is that you can't discharge without a permit, but once you get a permit, you can't discharge. So it's a legal requirement that's not typical for discharge permits. So there is one exception to that. If you are a large farm and you are permitted and there is a major flood event. So if you have a 25-year, 24-hour flooding event, and if you discharge from that, there's so much rain that goes into your manure pit and your manure pit goes over the top because of that flooding event, that is permissible with a CAFO permit. And that is the kind of the one exception. I don't think there are any others. There may be one for a structural failure that's not planned if you've met all the requirements, but essentially you can't discharge. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, sorry that I finish your thoughts. I was just thinking along these lines, anything different than with MFO or LFO wraps as far as you're not allowed to discharge or you need a plan to stop that discharge, right?
That's what's so interesting about it. It's the same. It's whether you have a federal CAFO permit or you have a state LFO or MFO permit.
Or SFO.
It's a little different for smaller farms, but it's the same. Basically, the federal law and state law are almost identical. There's some very small, subtle changes. So that is the key thing. If you're a farm, you can't discharge. Doesn't matter if you are discharging, you might need to get a federal CAFO permit, but you still can't discharge. All farms, right, in Vermont can't discharge. I mean, that's state law. And that's what the legislature did. That's why it's ironic to me that we're here, is we have some of the most comprehensive, restrictive water quality regulations in the country. And essentially, if you're a farm in Vermont, you have to meet the federal no discharge standard, even if federal law doesn't apply to you. And the legislature did that back in 2004 and then made it even more stringent in 2016. So the reality is you're a farm in Vermont, you can't discharge. But under federal law, and so that, I guess my point is this is not a water quality issue, this whole discussion, it's a legal issue. And that doesn't make it unimportant because it is very important that we follow laws, both federal and state. But this whole question about whether you need a CAFO permit or don't need a CAFO permit has nothing to do with water quality. It has everything to do with legal requirements. And under the law, if you are a discharging farm and you can't quickly correct the remedy, you need a CAFO permit. But then once you have the CAFO permit, you're subject to the same requirements as you're already subject to before you had the permit. So it's meaningful because we do have to follow the law. And if we're not following the law, there are consequences to that, both for the state, ANR could lose its delegation to be able to implement the Clean Water Act in Vermont, not just for farming, but across the board. There's liability that can attach to farms, but that's kind of always if they are discharging and not following the law. So I just think in the framework, as we think about how we move forward, everybody should know that farms are heavily regulated now. And that doesn't mean, I'm not saying there's always room to improve, but it's just a legal issue. If you discharge, you need one kind of permit. If you don't, you're required to have the other sort of permit. And that's what this whole thing is about.
Anyone else?
Okay. Steve, can you speak to if if a farm has a discharge from the production area, point source area, and they have a discharge and it can't be fixed immediately, and you have to get a CAFO permit. Two questions. Are we still subject to fines at that point? Or are we just subject to getting a CAFO permit and working towards fixing the problem? And if we get the CAFO, is it true that we only pay one fee and that is to A&R then instead of ag? We don't pay the LFO, we just pay the CAFO fee.
So a couple things there. First, if you have a discharge from your farm, that's a violation of the Clean Water Act,
Yeah.
whether you have a permit or not. So within that, because it's a violation, then A&R, and this is all up to A&R, not to us, but A&R has the ability to, it needs to enforce. It has discretion about how it does that. So it certainly will require a fix, because if you don't have the fix, then there's just ongoing violations every day. It also has the ability to impose fines and penalties, and that would depend on its assessment. You know, a lot of factors in there, but including the extent of the harm, whether or not it's a first offense or repeat offense, you know, whether or not the farm is cooperative in trying to fix it, any mitigating factors there might be, the farm's ability to pay. So there's a whole litany of things that A&R would have to look at in deciding. I think, you know, our approach, and we get criticized for this, is our approach is we always think the most important thing is the fix, is we don't want ongoing pollution. So the thing that is most important to us from the agency is to stop the problem. We also issue penalties, and we also, you know, we do penalize farms, but we also are trying to, we care more about the water quality than we do about how much money we get into our agency from penalties. But you need to have penalty authority, or you can't require enforcement from someone who won't do it. And if a farm keeps ignoring us or keeps having the same violation, then our penalty structure goes up. It goes up above $10,000 in total penalties. We have a memorandum of understanding with both the Attorney General's office and with the Agency of Natural Resources that will refer that to the Attorney General's office, and then they evaluate with us what sort of steps we should take. So A&R will have the same enforcement authority we do, except it's in their bailiwick and not ours. And they're going to have to make those judgments about what's most important to them and how to enforce it with the farm. But from a clean water perspective, whether it's under state law or federal law, what you don't want is pollution. And so, you know, that from my perspective, that has to be number one priority. That doesn't mean that's the only thing, but ongoing pollution is what this whole program is about, to stop it.
And you only pay for one permit, whether it's.
Sorry, yes. Yeah, that's a change in S-124 that I'll be talking about in a minute.
Okay.
But yes, the point is to have one fee, not two. Yeah.
Representative O'Brien.
So Steve, was the motivation for Conservation Law Foundation's suit on this wasn't that like A&R's being lax and farms are polluting it, was that A&R just isn't taking the lead on regulating this?
I mean, they're much better to explain their motive than I am, but my understanding is they want A&R to do the work because they think that A&R will be harder on farms and that they will issue bigger penalties and that they will be more rigorous in their enforcement. So I don't really think that CLF ever wanted EPA to de-delegate. Maybe they did. I don't think so. I think they just believe that A&R will be tougher on farms. And that's a legitimate perspective. You know, it's not one that we share, but we're open to, you know, if anyone thinks that we're not doing it well, we're open to that. It doesn't mean we're going to change, but we want to hear about things that we're not doing well. But we're also very aware of farmers' financial issues. And we want, if there has to be money spent to a fix, we'd rather that they put their resources toward the fix and they give it to us. Not everyone agrees with that. Someone thinks a $50,000 fine should always be imposed, or $20,000, whatever it is. You know, we have a matrix and we look at it and we try to get more aggressive with the people who aren't doing what they're supposed to and be more cooperative with the people who are. I'm very comfortable with that strategy, but it depends on your perspective. You know, if all you care about is one thing and it's that, then that's what you focus on. And any pollution has to be vigorously addressed. And if a farm goes out of business because of it, that's just what it is. we have a little broader perspective because we're losing all of our farms anyway, and in part because of this. This is, the Clean Water Act and those requirements. It's another very significant cost, and it's very hard to know exactly what drives a farm out of business, but every additional expense is a piece of that, and this is very expensive. It's very worthy, but it's very expensive.
But as far as the agency goes, I mean, you feel you're pretty tough on water pollution and the farmers are doing a pretty good job.
I think we're doing a great job regulating. We make mistakes. Everyone does. Sometimes I think there are times we're too lenient. I think there's also been some times when we're too harsh. But we really, and it's taken time. We started doing this. We've been doing it for a long time, but it got a lot more aggressive around 2016. And it's taken time to build out those programs. And the more you see, we try to always be consistent, and that's a real challenge because every farm's a little different. Factors are always a little bit different. It's difficult, and we understand the financial vulnerabilities of farms too. And I mean, since 2003 or 4, when we first got this responsibility, we've probably lost about 1,000 of the farms that we would have been regulating then. And since the Clean Water Act passed in 2016, we probably lost about half of that again. So, because remember, we're talking about concentrated animal feeding operations here, and all farms are subject to water quality requirements. But if you're talking about CAFO, that involves animals. So it's a balance, and I don't know that anyone has the perfect solutions. But yeah, our people are not out there like kissing farmers. They're out there regulating them.
So we can ask, it might be better to ask that question, not to the Agency of Agriculture, but to the plaintiffs in the case. And so we do have the Lake Champlain Committee, which one of the three, I think, is coming in tomorrow. And if we wanted to hear from CLF or the Natural Resources Council on this, we could have them in again as well. But I do want to just say, and maybe even ask you, Steve, if you want to characterize the EPA's position in their September letter. So leaving aside the intent of the people who filed the petition, what is the EPA saying?
So the EPA initially said they wanted everything to go to ANR, and we pushed back on that because the EPA has zero authority over what the state of Vermont does with the state of Vermont's water quality protections. EPA has every right under the sun to enforce the federal Clean Water Act. But in Vermont, we've already extended those federal protections under state law to far beyond what EPA's authority. The EPA's authority is much, much more limited than the state of Vermont's authority. So when the EPA was saying, to ANR, we want you to do it all, that just vastly exceeded what they have a right to say. They can say it, but they can't enforce it because they only have authority over farms that are discharging. The state of Vermont regulates all farms. And so for them to say which agency of the state has to enforce state water quality rules, they don't have that authority. They can delegate if they want. And so we obviously EPA is our partner. We have to work with the EPA. So nobody was repudiating anything that EPA was saying. But ANR went back to them with a counter proposal, which was to make sure that the Clean Water Act is being appropriately enforced in Vermont, which EPA has every right to ensure. So it's been some back and forth since then, but the EPA has most recently said they seem to be completely on board with this proposal. They've reviewed S124. They made comments on earlier drafts. It was first S100 and S124, but they've commented on the language and the concerns that they have been incorporated into this draft. So yeah.
So they're on board with it, but it's also fair to say that they're saying you have to do this.
We have to. ANR has to enforce if ANR is going to continue to be a delegated entity to enforce the Clean Water Act in Vermont, ANR has to enforce the CAFO component of the Clean Water Act in Vermont. So, and the reality is ANR has that authority already, but the law was not as clear as it could be. And there were some updates that make sense to have. And so EPA is very supportive of this legislation, which makes it clearer what ANR's authority is and creates there's some things that arguably were confusing about our authority that EPA wants to change. Everybody's on board with that. And that's a key point. I mean, we've been working, and despite all of the Despite all the allegations, we've always been working with ANR on these issues, and we continue to work with the ANR on these issues. And we're in lockstep. Our agencies and the administration are in lockstep on S124. We know we have to properly enforce the Clean Water Act in Vermont. And we have to do that. And we're going to keep working to do a better job of it. And if a CAFO permit needs to be issued, a CAFO permit needs to be issued. That's ANR's job to do. And if a farm needs a CAFO permit, they need to get one, they need to follow it. If they no longer need one down the road, they can opt out. If they don't have ongoing discharges. So there isn't anyone in either agency that has any issue whatsoever with the federal and state law being enforced. It's just we believe that the ag agencies doing it, there's some significant benefits to that because of our work, our cooperation, our work, our history with farming. We also do a lot of the technical support and a lot of the investment. And I don't know if everyone shares this perspective, but from my personal perspective, it's a huge benefit for us and ANR to be working together on it because whenever you are in a room with somebody who agrees with you, you don't learn a hell of a lot. But when you're in a room where there's people with different perspectives, there's value added and you actually learn some things and you actually do things better, generally speaking, if you're willing to compromise and work together. So I think both of our agencies, even though we don't always agree, I think both of our agencies talking together, talking about the issues, discussing them is better for everyone because then we're bringing more perspectives and we're helping each other be more accountable. So I have no problem with disagreement. I don't like paralysis, but disagreement is healthy.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we get that perspective every year at our inspection. ANR's always been there at our inspection, but to this point is the working group that's being established on setting the rules up for this. It's going to be all the stakeholders, not just farmers. It's going to be all the stakeholders, BNRC, CLF. I'm sure Champlain Watershed will have a member there. And it would be great to get them in a room together with a referee so people can come around to understand where everyone's coming from on this. Because we can make a better system.
We're always better off working together, but that requires compromise.
So, Steve, do you want to? I don't know. Maybe there was more intro we had, but
No.
And just before you jump to specific sections, I wanted to say, and if we don't have time to get to it all this morning, but there are a couple of sections here that we understand are not in the bill that are not related to the EPA's concerns that are the separate issues. So if we don't have time to get to that, we can have you back in.
Sure, I'm happy to come back, but there are 4 substantive changes, I would call them, in Title VI, which is, where your jurisdiction lies. So I was planning on talking about each one of them. There's a lot of other changes, but they're almost all just to conform to the Title X changes. But there are 4 things I was going to highlight. And the first one is vegetated buffers, and that's in Section 2. So that's page 4, line 21. So I'm looking at S124 as passed by the Senate. And
Line 21,
yes,
almost page 4.
yes. In that, so this is a little bit complicated, but it, make sure so almost all, as I said earlier, almost all of the state and federal requirements are identical, but this one's not. So for the legislature, when it adopted some of the water quality changes before, required farms to have a 25-foot vegetated buffer and a 10 for water and a 10-foot buffer for ditches. So that's the idea of the buffer, is obviously to protect water because a lot of the nutrients don't run off. They're trapped into the buffer. And so it's healthy for water quality. Under the federal large CAFO, so the large farms under federal law, it's different. For that buffer standard, farms have options. In Vermont, you have to have a 25-foot vegetated buffer. Under federal law, there's 3 different things you can do, actually more, but 3 options. You can have a 100-foot setback, which means you don't have to have any buffer at all. You just have to be 100 feet from water when you spread. So if you're spreading manure or nutrients, you got to be 100 feet away. So you don't need to have a buffer. Or you can have a 35-foot vegetated buffer, or you can have some other practice that's equivalent to the 100-foot setback. So as an example, in Vermont, They have I think it's you can have a 15-foot vegetated buffer if you use some other conservation tillage practice, and I think it might be injection and maybe no-till. I'm not sure about those, but in Vermont, there's a 15-foot buffer with some other conservation practices. So what we didn't want to do was, so under state law, you have to have a 25-foot vegetated buffer, and no farms in Vermont are a CAFO right now, so that works fine. But if a farm becomes a CAFO, then they would be, and state law doesn't change, then farms would be trapped. And the only thing they could do is have a 35-foot vegetated buffer, large farms, because you can't have less than 25 feet. So the 100-foot setback is out the window, and you can't do an alternative option that's less than 35 feet. So basically farms would be stuck. And the only thing they could do is have a 35-foot vegetated buffer. And that doesn't seem fair since there's these options that you can do. So all we were saying here is if you need to get a CAFO permit, the state law no longer applies and federal law does. And that gives farms more options, but it's consistent with federal law. So that's what that change is about. I don't know if anyone has any questions about,
Representative Hassan.
Yeah, I mean, you just said that there aren't any CAFOs in Vermont.
Correct.
So,
Well, go ahead, sorry.
so explain about that, because I mean, like I was actually doing some Googling yesterday and it said there were 37 CAFOs in Vermont. So much for Google. But I mean, my understanding is we do have confined animal operations. So what do we have and what don't we have and how does it fit with this? Because
So I should have been more explicit. We don't have any permitted CAFOs in Vermont. There's not a single farm in Vermont that has a CAFO permit.
okay,
And this gets a little tricky, but under federal law, a CAFO is a large farm,
yeah,
even if it doesn't have a permit. That's just the way they do it. So they call you, if you're a large farm under federal law, you're a CAFO. Doesn't mean you need a permit. Doesn't mean that you are permitted. They just use that term. But
what about the definition of animals are kept inside for 45 days or more?
yeah, so that's what a CAFO is, but it's different for a large farm under this is federal law.
Yeah,
If you have, so for using dairy as an example,
Yeah.
if you have 700 mature dairy animals or 1,000 cattle
Yeah.
in Vermont, you are a CAFO under federal law.
yeah,
You only need a CAFO permit if you're discharging, either through your production area or you're spreading on your fields and are not following your nutrient management.
so we have CAFOs, but they're not permitted by the way the federal government permits in some states.
Correct. And it's not unusual. New York is like the fifth biggest dairy state in the country, I think, has over 600 large farms. It doesn't have a single CAFO permit. They have a program under state law that's more expansive than federal law, but they don't have any CAFO permits. The EPA actually itself did not delegate its authority to Massachusetts or New Hampshire. So the EPA is responsible for water quality in those two states, a total of one CAFO permit. There's 0 CAFO permits in Massachusetts and there's 1 in New Hampshire. So some states have a lot of CAFO permits, some don't. It's kind of across the board. But if you are a large farm, or if you are a CAFO and are discharging, you need a permit. It gets trickier when you talk about smaller farms because they can still need a permit. But if you're not a large farm and you're not a medium farm and you're smaller and you're discharging, you only need a permit if you're also a significant contributor to pollution in the water. So it's a broader analysis. And the idea is the bigger farms have the most waste. So it's kind of a tiered approach where the standards are highest for the biggest farms. They're a little bit lower for the medium farms, but no farm can discharge out of a pipe as an example. But if you're talking about a smaller farm, if they're discharging, then there has to be kind of a proven water quality impact, not just the discharge itself. That's all federal law.
Representative Ryan.
Just quickly, so if we want to talk to a CAFO permitted dairy, where's the closest one? Pennsylvania?
New Hampshire's is one. There's one.
Hampshire's
Yeah. And Maine, I think Maine has some. I don't remember. Maybe 8 is in my head, but that might be totally wrong.
They do occasionally.
There are some.
There's some CAFO.
Yeah. And New York used to have a bunch of CAFO permits, and I haven't studied it closely enough. But in 2018, I think their Supreme Court threw out their program, and so they redid it. And now they don't have any CAFO permits.
Similar to us though, right? It's just called something else.
Yeah, they have a program, but it's not a CAFO program. So other questions about the buffer issue?
Let's move on to the.
Okay, yep. So the next change is section 3, so that's page 9, line 8. And Representative Nelson already raised this issue, but this is just You currently, if you have an LFO permit with the state of Vermont, you have to pay a $2,500 fee. Sorry, it's page 9, line 8. And we don't want a farm to have to pay. So if you're a large farm and you need a CAFO permit, you're still going to need an LFO permit because the LFO permit is broader than just discharge federal water. There's some construction issues in the LFO permit. There's also some ability to regulate nuisance. So it's broader than the federal CAFO permit. So you'll still need an LFO permit, but we don't want to double charge farms to have, pay for 2 permits. So if they need a large CAFO permit, there will be no fee paid to the Agency of Agriculture. There'll just be a fee paid to the Agency of Natural Resources. And, the reality we'll be regulating very differently on a large farm that has a CAFO permit because we know A&R will be taking care of all the discharge issues. And so our scope will be much smaller, but we still have a scope because it's kind of the LFO permit is more of a land use permit is how it started. And then it evolved into a water quality permit as well. So that's pretty straightforward, I gather. So the next sort of substantive, and this is curious, but section 5, page 15, line 15.
Page 25.
It's on page 15.
Yeah.
Make sure I'm on the right one here. Sorry. Page 15, line 15. Yep. So unfortunately for you, this requires a little bit of explanation, but there is a manure spreading ban in Vermont, which I think you all know about. So you can't spread from December 15th to April 1st. That does not come from federal law. That's a state law requirement only. That's been in place since at least 2006, I think longer, but I know since at least 2006, back when instead of the required agricultural practices, there were the accepted agricultural practice. So that's just a rule the agency enforces for water quality. So that manure spreading ban in the winter started out as a rule. It was not in statute. And in that rule, there's always been an ability for the Agency of Agriculture to grant an emergency exemption. So if someone in the winter, if their manure pit breaks and there's, a direct discharge to a river, that could be an emergency that we don't want to just have the manure keep running into the river.
Representative Murray.
So we have given exemptions.
We have, yep. So the exemptions have been there as long as the ban has been there. So they've always been part and parcel of the same thing. Some years we issue none, other years we issue some. It's pretty sporadic, but it varies. But so the ban was always there. In 2013, the legislature, and I wasn't here then, but I think it was in Senate Natural Resources, wanted to create an additional ability other than just the emergency exemption. They created the seasonal exemption. So the seasonal exemption there's another way that farms can spread in the winter if they meet a whole host of criteria. But and that's what this section is, 4816. So if you look at page 15, that's what that whole section is about, the seasonal exemption. But the first language reinstitutes the ban that we've always had in our rule, but it doesn't mention the exemption. So I read this a couple of years ago and I said, this isn't good. Why is this like it is? And I was told that the intent was to create this new exemption and to memorialize the ban that was in the rule in the statute, but there wasn't it didn't also incorporate the exemption. So we have been continuously using the emergency exemption, but I don't like the way the statute reads. To arguably, it doesn't allow it. And so this is just a cleanup to memorialize existing practice. We don't believe this is any change in the intent that was ever there, but I don't want to be, we'd like this to be cleaned up, to be clear that we can do what we've always been doing. As far as I know, this was completely inadvertent. No one's ever brought it to us. No one ever said to us, you can't do this. It's just, I read it and said, I don't like this.
Is the language on line 13 and 14, so the existing language in section A here, is that duplicate language that exists elsewhere, saying that there's a prohibition during those months?
It's also in our rule, and it was in our rule before it was in statute, and then it was put in statute, and then our rule's been revised since then, and it's still in our rule. but it's not in another statutory provision.
Okay, so I was gonna ask whether it would make sense possibly to clean it up by deleting the entire section A, but then it wouldn't be in statute at all.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Representative Nelson.
Go ahead and delete it. I didn't say that, sorry, blurt. Editorializing. The only time I know since this rule has been created that it was blanket exemptions given was after the floods of 23, when our manure pits all filled up with water. Because we can't discharge, we had to collect our production areas.
Yeah.
And fortunately, we had the mildest start to winter ever. And we were able to go on bare ground. Appreciation for that.
And while that was actually done pursuant to the governor's executive, the emergency executive order because of the flooding, and actually farmers came to us early and said, we could spread right during when it was still during the season, but the fields were so saturated. It was legal for them to spread, but unwise because they would have dug up their fields and everything would have run right off. So farmers came to us early into A&R early and said, we don't want to spread now, but we also can't be stuck with all this manure in the winter. So we worked, they worked with us, we worked with them. And luckily it was good that year where we were able to issue kind of some broad exemptions. So, yeah.
Not to take Representative Nelson's suggestion and run with it too far, but since the climate is changing, has there been any conversation about whether those dates, and I don't know how long we've had these dates, are still the right dates?
Yeah, we are talking about it, and they're not the right dates, and they might be the right dates in some parts of the state and not other parts of the state. I think it's worthy of I think we should be discussing it, and we are talking to A&R about it, and I think it's a worthy topic for the stakeholder group. Because what we don't want to do is the nice thing about the ban is it creates clarity. And so, because if you spread on frozen ground or you spread on saturated ground or you spread in, bad conditions, it can be a discharge, which can be a violation of the Clean Water Act and state law. And it can also require a permit. So there's implications so that it's clean, but it's also, there are times when you could easily spread in January or in March. And so I do think I think it's worth talking about, and we will be talking about it. And federal law doesn't require it. Federal law just has, its own set of standards, but we just want to do it thoughtfully so we don't create problems. And we think there are options, but we don't want to put people in a jam by taking something that's clear right now and making it unclear and perhaps not easy to implement.
So that's the third.
Yep. So this last one is really, it has nothing to do with the CAFO. Actually, this emergency exemption has nothing to do with CAFO. And then this last one, it's section 6, so it's page 17, line 17. This is simply an administrative cleanup. We're trying to lessen the administrative burden on farms and also on our staff. So right now, every farm that's a certified small farm, and so that for dairy, that's 50 cows to 199 cows. But it's also produce farms, other farms that are certified small farms. If you are in that category every year, you have to file a piece of paper with us that says you're complying with the required agricultural practices. So it's just, we don't need that. We don't need them to send us a piece of paper. We need them to follow the rules, but we don't need them to file a piece of paper every year that says they're following the rules. And it's burdensome on us and them when they don't do it. And we spend staff time, chasing those down. So what we're proposing is that we want to know about every new farm. So if you come into that category, you have to file the certification so we know about you, because there is no farm registry in Vermont. So this is one of the ways that we keep track of who we should be regulating. And then if there's a farm that we want them to regularly certify, this would give us a discretion to require that. We're having problems with them, but it's essentially just have them certify when they come into the program and then as needed, but not every year. So that's, I don't know if that raises any concerns.
So you're perhaps changing on line 16, you're changing, provided that the secretary shall, maybe from will require to a shall require.
Yeah, right now they have to do it every
Yeah, so
year.
will require, so, right.
And now they only have
Change
to,
it to shall,
well, now they have to if they're new.
yeah.
And then this would give us the discretion to require it beyond when they're new if we believe it's necessary.
And how often do they get inspected?
They have to be inspected at least every 7 years, but we'll go to any farm on a complaint basis. So any farm can be inspected and will be inspected if there's a complaint, but it's as part of our regular schedule, it's every 7 years.
So the distinction here is newly identified, so newly eligible, but also now newly identified.
Yeah, if you come into the category, so we don't know, you haven't already done it, you haven't already told us, you haven't already certified to us, and now you've grown, or we find out about you, that's the identified, is you may have been, maybe you should have certified 5 years ago, but we didn't know about you. So the idea is if you fit into the category or we find out about you, then you have to certify that initial time and then any time thereafter and that would really be if we're having trouble with a farm and we need them to be affirmatively telling us every year, yes, we're aware and yes, we're complying. And that would probably be accompanied by our ongoing checkup inspections as well.
All right. Now I know that we're only halfway through the bill, but this is the Title VI section.
Yeah.
And then after this, it moves into Title 10. So,
and I really wasn't going to, I'll talk about whatever you all want to, but I wasn't going to talk about the Title 10 issues. It's all to make sure that A&R can enforce federal law appropriately. We're fully supportive. We've worked with them on the language. We agree with everything. I was going to, if you have time now, or I can come back, whatever works. I was going to talk to you about the one change that we'd like, which is to change the federal CAFO standard. Right now, the federal CAFO standard is tied to the state definition of water. And we believe the federal CAFO standard should be tied to the federal definition of water, which is waters of the United States. That's the way the language was originally presented. We agreed upon it. That's how it was originally presented. Then there was some concern about, because of what's happening federally and what's happening with the EPA potentially, the federal definition changes more frequently than the state definition. So there was some concern about what will happen if the federal definition changes. So then it got switched to waters of the state definition, but we've continued to talk about it and the agencies agree we really should have the federal program tied to the federal definition. And I want to explain, why our position is on that. If do you have time now, or if you?
Well, yes, yes, for sure. If you can just point us to the page in the line. And I, while you're finding that, I'm pretty sure that we heard yesterday from Secretary Moore that her agency was okay with and actually preferred the language that's in the bill. So I just wanted to flag that.
I don't
So if that's
think
not the case, then
so.
we can get that aired and we'll try and sort that out.
I sort of half listened to that testimony when I was doing something else, but we've talked about this. We're all on the same page about it. So if she said that, I don't think it was intentional because.
Okay, well, we'll figure that out. But,
Yeah.
or let you figure that out.
Yeah.
But what page are we on?
Well, it's kind of through, let me look at the core.
There's a definition section. So
Yeah, and it's there, but it's waters of the US is defined. So on page 24, waters of the US is defined, but that's not where it matters.
Rich Hardy was looking for this yesterday, wasn't it?
There's several, I mean, sorry. There's several places where it would have to be changed, so I didn't sort of scout for those. I was planning on just explaining our position and hoping you'd take it up and then identify the exact language if you want to do that. Sorry. Yeah, page 19.
Oh, down.
Thanks, Jared.
Page 19. We disagree with them, but at least I'll.
Appreciate that. This is agricultural waste on mine, that page 19. It's an older version.
Section, Jared.
Sorry, Jared Carpenter, Champlain Community, section 7. Which is about 19-ish, I'm looking at slightly older.
Okay.
Definition 13.
It's on, yeah, 8, bottom of 8.
Yeah, section 19.
So are you talking about waters or waters of the state definition, Jared? Is that?
That's what you're looking for.
Well, that's a place, but it's not the only.
It is sort of throughout.
Yeah, it's through, that's where it is defined, but maybe it'd be better if I,
Yeah, I mean, and so, but again, my understanding was that, so here we are at the bottom of page 18, and the definition of waters or waters of the state is these things and waters of the United States. So it includes waters of the United States. And my takeaway yesterday was that there's a request to change that definition. So are you, maybe I didn't want to misunderstand what you were saying.
no, and so we're not asking to change that particular definition because, so the way the water quality is set up for CAFO for their whole program, they regulate a lot more than farms. And so it makes perfect sense for them when they're regulating everything else other than farms to have waters of the US included within waters of the state, because the state can go higher than the federal law, it can't go below the federal law. So if they're regulating a wastewater treatment plant under the federal CAFO program, they have to regulate for waters of the United States because that's what federal law requires. But they have been given authority to also regulate the waters of the state, but that's not for farms. The reason this matters for farms is the whole point of this bill is that ANR will enforce federal law and the state of, and Agency of Agriculture will enforce state law. So farms already under state law cannot discharge to waters of the state. Waters of the state is covered under state law. The whole ANR program for farms, not for everything else, but for farms, is only to implement federal law. That's why this whole bill is written, is that if you need a discharge permit under federal law, you got to go to ANR. But if you tie that program to the state law definition, it's confusing for a lot of reasons, and it's completely unnecessary because the only reason, there's no reason to require a farm to go into a federal program because of a state law violation. So under state law, they can't discharge to state waters. Under federal law, if they discharge to federal waters, they're required to get a permit. We don't think there's any reason to make, because remember, there's no farm in Vermont right now that has a federal permit. So why make a farm get a federal permit for a state law water quality issue that's already regulated under federal law? And it's more than that, because there's some implications about getting a permit that are different. So this definition we're fine with, because it makes sense. When they're doing the other programs, they need to do both federal law and state law. But when it comes to CAFO, and it is further in here when it's defining when you need a permit, it says there's places where it says if you discharge to waters of the state instead of waters of the US. And originally, as proposed, it was waters of the US. So just keeping in mind all the federal regulations, the whole program is based on discharges, and that's to waters of the United States. So if you tie that to waters of the state, you're changing the whole program. And it's a little complicated with what's waters of the US and what's waters of the state. The waters of the state is not always broader. It's sometimes broader. And maybe the best example is a small pond that's not connected to any other water. That's a water of the state. It's not a water of the United States. But waters of the United States is also sometimes broader than waters of the state, because waters of the US includes wetlands that have a continuous connection to other waters. So there's no wetlands covered under waters of the state. So they're different. And so making someone get a federal permit for a discharge to a state body of water just doesn't make any sense to us, and it's confusing. Like why, like what's even the basis if you're extending it to state water? But more importantly, it's not required because the farm already can't discharge to that state water under state law. So it's confusing enough as it is. When we talk about this whole umbrella, no one can discharge. That's the law. The question is whether you need a federal permit because you are discharging or you don't because you're not discharging. So to further blend those principles is, I think, untenable and confusing, but it also has some consequences for the farm because a farm, under the Clean Water Act, if you violate the Clean Water Act, Congress gave any citizen the right to enforce that. So if the farm violates the Federal Clean Water Act, any citizen can sue. It's not like nuisance where you actually have to be injured. Any citizen can enforce it. Any environmental group can enforce it. So anybody can sue a farm for a violation of the Federal Clean Water Act. That's the way it is. But why extend that authority to everyone if it's some state body of water that's actually has nothing to do with the Federal Clean Water Act? So it's creating additional potential liability to a farm to be sued. And I don't even know that I don't think it would necessarily be appropriate for someone to bring a Federal Clean Water Act violation because you discharge to a state water, but it gets really tricky. Once you have that permit and then you violate your permit, then you're already within that jurisdiction and you're subject to suit. So it's confusing to blend the programs when there's no need because every farm is regulated. And then there's also that potential liability to a farm, which we don't see the reason to create. I mean, farms are already liable on other grounds if they're not following the rules, as you've learned about a nuisance recently. But why create a federal civil action that can be filed in federal court if a farm discharges to its own internal farm pond? I mean, it literally could be a farm pond that the farm dug so that it could feed its cows, and then it's discharging to it. Can't do that under the law, and we could enforce about that. But if you use the waters of the state definition instead of the waters of the U.S. definition, A&R could require the farm to get a permit for discharging to its own pond.
Okay, thank you. I understand the distinction now, and I did see a hand from Representative Lipsky. If you want to take one more question, and then we're after time here, so we'll wrap up.
Steve, I'm more of a visual learner and I remember a pie chart. And I went out and miraculously found it, but there are two sources of phosphorus loading. Two categories. One is point source, the other is non-source. In Vermont and for Lake Champlain, the primary 6% of phosphorus loading comes from wastewater treatment plants. The most is who regulates, and they discharge. Sometimes there's an inch of rain, they discharge, depending. Who regulates that loading?
A&R.
A&R.
Yeah.
Have they been fined?
I mean, they regulate it and they have compliance schedules, I think, for folks who are not complying, but
are those 30-year schedules?
I don't know enough to talk.
We won't dwell on that. But let's say 38% is from agriculture, which is highly regulated. There's another 19% that come from street banks, which every time it's a half inch of rain up to 5 inches of rain, every river in the state, whether it's the Winooski or the Lamoille, look like the Big Muddy. So half of happens weekly from stream banks. It's another 20% comes from forest land, not from logging, just from rain falling, draining downslope into a watershed. No one's regulating that. If there's a forest operation, it's in violation. There may be a complaint enforcement, but I just think agriculture is the one segment, and there are other like urban development and roads that are other sources. But what we're dealing with here is totally focused on agriculture, and it's the most regulated and enforced. So I just think the perspective, Chairman of the committee, I'll end this, but we need, I think, the big picture of what's controllable, what isn't. What produces food and what just produces turbidity that urges eutrophication and other deleterious, long-term impacts in our waters has to be taken into perspective.
Well, I appreciate that. And as I said at the beginning, we're really proud of the work our farmers have done. And that doesn't mean it's over. There's more to be done, but we are proud of that. But you also talk about it's really difficult to stop water, period. If it comes down, it flows. And so what you try to do through all the various programs there are is where the highest risks are, you try to gather it, divert it, leach it. There's all these programs, but none of them are perfect. And that's something we try to talk about a lot over here is all of us pollute every day. Humans pollute. We also need to eat. And so we need water, we need food. And so it's the whole key is how do we find that balance, not make it so expensive for farms they can't be here anymore and we just push it off to someone else, but also protect our resources. And it's not easy. But if you lose sight of that, you're right. There's legacy phosphorus and there's ongoing pollution. And so how can we do it reasonably, pragmatically, but also effectively? And it will be a problem we're talking about in 50 years again, hopefully with a few farms still left.
Any other questions?
We have Steve back just because bunch of questions, but we're behind already today.
Okay, yeah, we'll try and line him up for next week.
Okay.
To see if there's more things that we need to ask.
Would you like me to send you the suggested changes where they would be for the water so that you?
Yeah, it might be helpful just so that we're seeing what you're talking about. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I'll do that.
I think we should take a little break. Let's keep it to 5 minutes though, because we're running a little late and got